America's workforce. Its strength is our nation's success. Join Ronnie Spellman on I Build America podcast as we explore innovative solutions and inspiring stories from leaders and workers shaping America. Discover actionable insights to build a motivated workforce.
I build America.
Welcome to Serato Live. We're here with Ronnie Spellman and Greg Taylor. Greg, welcome.
Well, thank you, Ronnie.
It's good to see you. Now, you and I have been spending a lot of time together recent. Not only you're a professional driver, but there's a lot more history to what you've done in your career. And I'm just kidding about the professional driver. I know that whenever I'm around you, you always seem to be the person doing all the driving. You're actually good at a lot of things, including leading an organization. What are you doing now?
Currently, I'm the executive director of Workforce Training Academy. So we're just a small part of what Serato does. Different avenue, kind of the same mission, different avenue. So
now, Serato Corporation has been doing a lot across the country with workforce development type programs, running and operating Job Corps facilities. But what's special about what your part of the business is? For us,
we kind of focus on the other population.
Right.
So Serato and Job Corps is stuck into a certain demographic or a certain age bracket for their participants, and for us, we kind of go after everybody else in the world, I guess. So
from a training perspective.
Yep. So
very nice. Now, when you say everyone else in the world, what is it that you're looking to help people do?
Well, the goal of Mr. Serato is to build a workforce. He sees it as a national crisis and a national defense crisis, particularly.
Okay.
So we all know that we don't have enough employees to fill the jobs that we currently have. So our thing is to, kind of give back and create that workforce as much as we can to help sustain the United States going forward.
That's true. And I know that workforce development is a huge issue across the country, as you mentioned. There are a lot of companies across the United States that are working really hard to try to find qualified and talented people. So you're helping to solve that issue.
Well, we're trying, on our small scale right now, but hopefully in the future that'll change.
Right.
I think more of a focus needs to be put on now, that. So,
and you're right. It's intriguing because I know that today we didn't necessarily want to speak about the work of the organization, but we want to talk about Greg Taylor. You're a kind of guy that's used to being quiet and not expressing a whole lot publicly, but your career and journey in your career has been absolutely astounding. So I've had a chance to talk to you in advance. I've had a chance to look at what you've achieved and what you've accomplished, and I'm amazed by it. And I know that a lot of people would love to hear your story, but we'll start. Where did you grow up?
Well, I grew up in the military. So my dad's a retired Marine, a Vietnam vet. So I traveled a lot. So there are things that are strange to me.
Sure. Like
growing up with cousins or having best friends for all of your life. That just wasn't anything that was part of my wheelhouse. Originally, I was born in California.
Okay.
I call home the Ozarks in Missouri because I started high school there. That's where my parents lived, where my parents died. My sister, my wife, her family's from there. So that's kind of home. So most beautiful place in the country.
And why is that?
It just is.
Yeah.
I mean, nature, and I live right on the lake.
Nice.
And things are pretty nice down there, nice and quiet.
So I learned something special, just to diverge slightly, but that lake has some special qualities that make it stay warm. So it's not as cold in the winter times, but
no, it's we get a lot more of the ice and stuff like that. The snow generally goes around us, particularly because of the lake and the temperatures,
right.
and I live right off the lake, so it's I should say my house is right off the lake. So
now, Greg, when you finally retired out of the service, you retired after 21 years. Is that correct?
Yeah.
So long journey, long career in the military.
Well, yeah, it was. Yeah. It wasn't just straight in and out and do what you do. There was a lot of twists and curves to it, and eventually where I ended up, and I had a good time doing it. Right. I'm not gonna lie, I had a great time doing it.
So let's walk through some of that, because when you and I discussed, you entered the military, you had 21 years. We definitely want to get to your transition out of the service and then to the private sector, and that part of your journey is just amazing to me. But let's go back to the beginning. You grew up in a military family, but my understanding is that your father didn't want you to go in the military.
No, I had been in the Army Reserves, and I'd been to basic training and all that stuff while I was still in high school. And my father wanted me to go to college and finish college.
Right.
And that way I would have been the first in the family to do that. And eventually I was the first in the family to do that. It just didn't take that path,
Right.
So, I was going to school. I was burnt out. My first year I finished, and I up and joined the Marines. And,
Okay.
He was mad. Oh,
Yeah.
he was mad. He kicked me out of the house, and because I was doing what I needed to do, what
Right.
I needed to do, not what he wanted me to do.
Sure.
So.
But let's walk that back, because there's a bigger story there. So you were in the reserves. What made you join the reserves? I don't know if I've heard of a lot of people joining the reserve while they're still in high school.
Yep. So it was a program that they have where you could go to basic training, and your parents signed for you at 17.
Okay.
I went to basic training, and then I came back, and then I finished my senior year, and then I had to go back and do the advanced individual training, which
Right.
I was a combat engineer
Right.
at that time, and I was just in reserves there for the school money,
Right.
because
Right.
that's what I intended to do. And next thing you know, I got a girlfriend, and that was getting serious, and and all of that stuff. So, I just switched over. So it's not really a big deal. You can always get a conditional release from the Reserve or National Guard for active duty. So.
Sure. Well, you say it's not a big deal, but I don't know if I had the wherewithal and the understanding that I could join the reserves in high school.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
And then have that experience. So you were getting good experience at a pretty early age.
Yep.
That helped you to understand what military service was like without going as active duty. Right.
Well, yeah, but with my dad and the rest of my family, service has always that's been the story of my life.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Even now, the
Right.
job that I currently have, I see it as more of a service as opposed to, and I enjoy it, so.
Yeah. So you started in the reserves in high school.
Mm-hmm.
You decided to go to college. You found that it wasn't the right fit for you, and after a year, you decided to leave.
Yep.
And then what?
Then I joined the Marines, and I went to training, and it's kind of weird. Ramon and I went to basic training or boot camp at the same place,
Yes.
10 years apart. And him and I were there together last month, and it was rather cool. I hadn't been there in 30 years. He hadn't been there in 40 years, but it didn't change.
Wow.
It was the same place. And I did that, went to AIT, became a heavy equipment operator in the Marine Corps. So I was a
Okay.
combat engineer and a heavy equipment operator, which kind of solidified the engineer
Sure.
branch
Sure.
for me,
So,
And
Greg, I'm going to stop you for a quick moment, though, because as we start to tell the Greg Taylor story, you, again, you went into the reserves. You then went to college for a year, decided to leave, and your father was not happy.
No.
Because he wanted you to represent the family and finish college. But you decided that you would go into the military, and he kicked you out of the house.
Yep.
And so my understanding is that you were essentially homeless, living with friends and the like for that period of time.
Yeah.
Right until you
It
went
was
to boot camp.
only a matter of 2.5 months,
Yeah.
so that really wasn't a big deal.
Not a
And-
big deal for you. I would have been terrified.
Oh, and then, when I finished boot camp, I came home. That's when he started treating me like an adult, like a
Right.
man,
Right.
so I get it.
Yeah.
It wasn't really his plan, but, it worked out in the
Right.
end, so.
Right. And that's pretty neat, though, because that's a lot of responsibility to try to figure out at 17, 18 and trying to determine where the rest of your life is going to be at that age.
Well, if anybody that knew me back then, I don't think that there was any doubt what my profession was going to be.
Sure. Sure.
So I have my father's profession,
Right.
so, and back in the day, that wasn't an uncommon thing, so.
How'd you decide on the Marines?
My dad was one, and I
Okay.
wanted a little bit more,
Okay.
than the Army experience that I had at the time, which is weird because I ended up eventually coming back around to that,
Sure.
so,
Sure.
yeah.
So you found the love of your life before you joined the Marines.
Oh, yeah, we went to high school together, so.
Pretty neat.
I dated the prom queen, man.
Did-
I'm just that guy, so.
Now, how does she feel about you leaving to go off to the Marines? Was she?
Well, she was still in school,
Right.
so she still had a couple years to finish up, and I don't know how does she feel, following me around the world for the next 30 years,
Right.
so.
We'll get there later.
Yeah.
But which I find amazing. That's a whole nother part of your journey that is probably one of the neatest pieces, I think, of all of your career. But we'll get to your spouse and family later. So you served your first term in the Marine.
Yep.
While in service, and then you left.
I did.
Why'd you leave?
I was just, it's one of those things, the grass is greener on the other side,
Sure.
and they were doing drawdowns after Desert Storm.
Right.
So this was in the early 90s.
Right.
And recruitment numbers, they didn't need so many, and, they told me I could be a cook. And
Right.
I said, no, I'm not going to be a cook.
Right.
Right.
So
those guys work hard. Cooks do.
That's true.
No, man.
Yeah.
So, I ended up separating, went back home.
Yeah.
Got me a nice.
So this was your first transition. Now, so I want to kind of break there just to say that this was your first transition. Now, you had a later transition after you went back in, but we'll get to that point. But your first transition, you're still young. Yep. You still, how old are you at this point?
24.
Yeah, 24. So a lot of statistics show that the vast majority of service members that serve transition after that first term. And they're still under the age of 25.
Yep.
And you were one of those.
Yeah, I was. Yeah.
And so how do you figure out life at that point? You're now married at that point, right? I think maybe a family on the way, kids on the way, and you decided to leave the military.
Yep.
Yeah, that's a big transition. And to some degree, I think maybe even unstabilizing for a lot of people that get out because they're trying to figure out how to build a career.
Yeah.
What'd you do?
The decision was, my wife had just had our first child while I was still in, and I separated within 6 months of her birth.
Oh, wow.
And so then we just went back home. We each got a job. The economy was pretty decent.
Right.
We come from a touristy area, so you have a job all summer long. That's not an issue,
Right.
and it's just find out what you can get. And I served beer at a drive-through convenience store, so it wasn't a bad gig. Plenty of hours, was paying and making ends meet. Mama watched my grandkid or her grandkid, so it was good, and then the wife said, "Hey, let's have some more kids," and I said, "I know where I can get them for free." So.
And so, it's pretty neat, and this is kind of one of the first pauses for me on the family front, is that your wife supported you going into the Marine early on. You were still young at the time. She was finishing up school. And then you went into service. You had a child, you got married. And then she supported you leaving. Mm-hmm. So each step of that way, she was there from a very supportive standpoint. And probably saying to you, Greg, you can do it. You're okay with this transition. And she stuck by you as you all worked as a family to figure out what was next.
Yeah. It was... It's been 33 years now.
Yeah.
So, and back in the day, it was you would go somewhere for a week or 2 weeks, and that was a big deal.
Right.
30 days on a field problem. But, later in my career where I'm 18 months down in Iraq, and that's when the real worry and the real stress of being a spouse is prevalent,
Right.
So,
all right, so you're out of the service now, you're working. First job was doing what again?
Selling beer at a drive-up window of a convenience store. It was great.
Then did you have other jobs as well during that period of time?
Well, I had a couple of different jobs. I started out with one, and then that kind of fell through. And I think I told the guy to go pack sand just because I could tell him to go pack sand.
Sounds like a 24-year-old, right?
Yeah. So, and then, it was what it was. So.
And so you're out, and then you started to feel. I'm not sure, this is my word, not yours, but I don't know if it's regret or just a feeling of a need to do something different or more.
Yeah, well, once you get out, you're in your mind, you're elevated while you're in. You're in a small community, a community for a purpose, and this and that. And when I was 24, 25, it really wasn't that, because I'd only spent 4 years in.
Right.
Later on, it was a lot different for me. But then it was manageable, it wasn't really a big deal,
and that's an interesting point to make, that when you're in for 4 years, you get a taste of what it's like. But if you're in much longer, you really understand that this is a life and a lifestyle. You have a full career at 4 years, you're still trying to figure out what the life is going to look like. So at 4 years, you kind of thought that you had your own ideas of what it represented, but then you left.
Yep.
And then decided to come back. So you decided to go back in, but you couldn't return to the Marines.
No, for them, it's like committing the original sin. Is once
Right.
you get out, and it was 95, and it was they were still doing drawdowns from Desert Storm. So the guy's like, can't help you, don't have any space for you. And
Right.
I came out of his door, and the Army guy see me coming out of his door, and he said, hey,
So you
what's
went
up?
to the recruiting office is
Yep.
what you did for the Marines.
Yeah.
And they said, well, Greg, sorry, we
Yep.
can't help you.
Yep.
And then as you were walking out, there was a Army guy there as well in the hallway who said, Greg, let's talk.
Yep.
Yeah.
He just pulled me in his office, asked me what my deal was. I told him. He punched my numbers into the computer, and next thing you know, it's like, let me talk to my boss. And I get a call 3 days later, when you want to leave. And I was like,
That's fantastic.
that's what I'm talking about
Yeah.
right there. So.
And the family was all in again.
Oh,
They
yeah,
said, Greg,
yeah.
we're supporting you.
Yeah.
Your
Yep.
dad is supporting you by this point. Like he recognized that you're doing something great by
Well-
returning to the military.
Yeah, well, it was always about, belonging to something bigger than myself,
Absolutely.
so, and that's part of that whole service thing is, you know.
Right.
So.
So what's neat is that you go back. So you were in the Marine to start. Well, you were in the reserves, high school. You join the Marine, and then you leave the Marine. You transition out. You work in the private sector, and then return to the military, but this time in the Army.
Yep.
And at this point, you started to find your belonging because you were deployed, I presume, soon after joining the Army, right?
Yeah, well, I mean, we would always have field I was a combat engineer again, so I mean, I was always out in the field, that whole combat thing in the title, so, and it was good. And then I did a trip to Korea, and
Okay.
then I came back, and I was stationed. I had advanced home base assignment, which is something they do.
Right.
So I knew where I was going, and the family was already established. So by that time, I'd bought a house.
Right.
And I moved over to be an instructor
Right.
in that part of my career, which I really, really enjoyed a lot. And then, later on, 2005, that war sounded pretty good. And so I was like, I might want a part of that. So.
Well, and you're right. You decided to go into direct combat.
Yeah.
But what was interesting, Greg, in our conversation, what you told me, and then I'd love for you to walk us through some of the areas you served in combat. But what you mentioned to me is that second return to the military, one, I guess there was some level of maturity. As you were growing, you were married, you had a family. But then you said to me that you found your mission. And part of going into combat helped you to find your purpose on what you were supposed to be doing in serving the United States of America, right?
Yep. So for me, it's like a lot of us, we spend 20 years training and we don't get to.
Yeah.
What our job is war.
Right.
I was fortunate enough, if you could use that word, to serve during wartime.
Right.
So when I looked at the military as a whole, it made sense to me. Being in garrison with nothing going on around the world, that doesn't make too much sense to me. You're painting
Right.
rocks.
Right.
You know what I mean?
Right.
So for me, it was. And my purpose was, now don't get me wrong, I'm not an infantry guy. I'm not the biggest guy on the battlefield, but for my part of that job and my part of that war, I was really good at it. And I enjoyed what I did. I enjoyed the soldiers that I had. And, it was what it was. I've had the best days of my life in combat and some of the worst days of my life,
Right.
So, I mean, it kind of, I had a good time. I'm not even going to lie.
So tell us this, especially for those that didn't serve in the military. I grew up in a military community. I didn't serve. My parents didn't serve. They were Department of Navy civilian. But you mentioned this, too, in our conversation. So not only did you find your mission, but then you found a group of people that you connected with. Like you were there for the same purpose.
Yep.
You were there for the same mission. You spent a lot of time, particularly in the combat zone areas. You got to know one another. You had to trust them. They had to trust you. You depended on one another. And these dependencies were life requirements, right? Because you're in an area that if something went wrong, you needed to depend on them to save your life or to help protect you.
Yep. So, generally for the majority of the population, the person that they're closest to is probably their spouse.
Right.
And don't get me wrong, my wife and I have been married for 33 years, and she is my partner.
Right.
But there's things about me that she doesn't know. Stemming that the fellows that I serve with, that they know.
Right.
You know what I mean? So it's a different type of bond. It's a different type of love. It's kind of a weird thing, but it's existed throughout time.
Right.
I mean, I don't know how to explain it. I mean, the camaraderie, the friendship, the level of care, the amount of dependency that you put on each other. You talk about, for your country, for mom and apple pie, but when it comes down to it, it's the guy next to you. And that's why you do it,
So walk me through some of those combats, because this is important to get to talking about the transition. I think overall, we want people as a part of our discussion to understand what it's like for a service member to transition out of service. Just some of the challenges that you go through and going from a very structured environment to getting into the private sector, making sure that you have the necessary training, making sure that you have the contacts to find the right next job that can utilize your background and experience in the military. But talk us through some of your deployments. Where were you stationed? What environment was that? For a lot of us that have never been in active duty and much less war, it's intense where you've been.
Yeah, it can be. So I spent almost 3 years in Iraq. Not 3 years straight, but different tours, different time frames. 15 months was longest, and then I eventually went to Afghanistan for a year. After that.
These aren't vacations. This is during the middle of an active war.
Yeah, during the surge. So, 05.
The surge after 9/11.
Yeah,
the attack of 9/11. Yeah.
At the end of 05, 06, 07, 08, 09, I spent almost every part of one of those years in Iraq.
Right.
And like I said, I had a good time. My job was IEDs. I ran around looking for finding IEDs, and then
so I can tell you,
them.
I can tell you with a pretty good level of confidence that most people wouldn't define finding IEDs a lot of fun.
Well, that's what I was trained to do. That was my job, and like I said, I was really good at that job, and I put a lot of. If I missed something, I took it personal.
Now, real quick, for those that might not know what an IED is, can you tell everyone else what an IED is?
Improvised Explosive Device, so the roadside bombs.
So you're going around trying to find these items that could blow you up.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I'm trained.
Yeah.
I have combat enablers. I have robots. I have explosives.
Wow.
I mean, for a guy from Missouri, it's like, give me big guns and explosives.
Right.
Okay, yes, sign me up.
So you're in Afghanistan.
Yeah, I spent a year in Afghanistan. Okay. That was my last tour.
Okay.
I thought after 3 years in Iraq, I had that war thing figured out, and then Afghanistan was a different animal.
Sure.
And it brought a lot more stress. And the position that I was filling, I was a platoon sergeant at the time, and so I'm responsible for, as a squad leader, 13 guys, as a platoon sergeant, 40 plus.
Wow.
So it's and all their equipment and all their, what they do, what they fail to do, all that's on me. So. It was a little bit stressful, and I'd never done that position before. The guy that was there, he got hurt right before we deployed, so it was like, hey, man, you're the new guy. I was like, oh, okay, let's figure this out, So,
Greg, before we get to talking about your transition, you're trying to resolve bombs out in the battlefield.
Mm-hmm.
Tell me about, or tell the viewer listening to our program, looking at our program, about the attack that you had on your squad one day when you were out on patrol, I remember you telling me about you driving the vehicles, a group of you, and then what? You had someone decide to...
Yeah, so we were doing we were getting replaced, and we were almost to the end of our tour, you know. And so we take out the new guys, and we take them out, and we show them, the footprint of the area that we work in and this and that. And we pull up to this traffic circle, and nobody stops at that traffic circle. Yes. We cordon it off, we roll through, and then we keep on moving. Right. But for some reason, they wanted to stop, and they stopped. And, next thing you know, bad things happen. So something goes boom. Just happened to be a VBID or a vehicle-borne IED.
Yes.
And, nobody lives after that.
Right.
And so it had pushed its way up next to an RG-31, and it detonated, and it's catastrophic.
So how many vehicles are in the group of vehicles that you're
So
with?
it just depends on what your mission is.
Right. For that specific day,
nothing
though.
less than 3. We were 7 or 8, so we were rather big.
You have a convoy of 7 vehicles with our U.S. military members over in Afghanistan, right?
This was in Iraq.
In Iraq.
Yep.
And you're traveling through the streets, and usually you keep going because when you stop is when things happen that shouldn't happen. And the group stopped, these 7 vehicles stopped, and someone decides to drive a bomb into the middle of this convoy.
Yep. Yeah,
and you get out of the vehicle. Your vehicle wasn't impacted, but you hear the boom, you get out, and you're helping to rescue your fellow service members.
Well, we're trying to, yes. And, they put accelerants on with bombs and stuff to sling gelatized gasoline.
Wow.
So, I mean, that one fire extinguisher that you get per vehicle isn't going to cut it,
Right.
So
Right.
it was bad, and to this day, the smell of burning fuel is something that I don't really like, or,
Right.
and it's taken me a while to get to the point to where I know that affects me, so.
And in our conversation, I want to take a moment just to tell that history, because that's so important to understand as we begin talking about your transition out of the service. So great career, 21 years in the military in total. You have a couple of events like that, and that changes the psyche of a person, right? When you're seeing people in real world, real life, not on a video game, that are being blown up in their vehicles, it's hard.
Yep.
Right?
Yeah, it is. And that's the word, hard.
Yeah.
You get hard, you stuff those feelings
Sure.
down,
Yeah.
and you leave them down there, and then when you come home, you don't know what to do with them.
Right.
And you think that, you're the only one, and that nobody understands you, and, you start coping, and you start coping probably unhealthily.
Right.
So, I started drinking a lot.
Yeah.
And the best thing the Army did for me was to send me back.
Right.
Because, well, for one, in my mind, I wasn't done.
Right.
But it got me away from the booze,
Right.
so I couldn't pull a cork,
Right.
And that's the way that it went until my last tour,
Yeah.
And then after that, it became, me being inside my head.
Right.
And, and it was what it was. And I went to treatment for PTSD.
Right.
But by that time, the alcohol already had a hold of me,
Right.
So it was like, so, okay, by the way, I have a drinking problem now,
Right.
so it's, and that's not uncommon.
Right.
Some people get hurt and they come out addicted to prescription painkillers,
Right.
Some guys, opt to take another way out, and end their life.
Right.
It just depends on you and
It
where
is.
you're at in that. But,
and-
through all those struggles, I've learned a lot of stuff, so that's
So let's dig into the transition. I know we only have a few minutes to go, but I want to point out one thing that you and I discussed. You began drinking as part of the coping, but you mentioned something that really stood out to me. You were fortunate because even though you were drinking, you mentioned to me that you were more of a closet drinker. You didn't do it in public. You weren't at bars getting drunk. You weren't getting DUIs. You didn't have any. So for our company, I want them to know you have a good record.
Yep. Yeah.
But no, you didn't take any of that action. So it was at home behind closed doors, but you needed it to help you get through those 21 years of active duty.
Yeah.
And that's something that you personally did. But when you began to transition, walk us through your last 6 months, because you did something that I thought was incredible and in many ways heroic. You had an opportunity to build a transition time in your transition. So walk us through those 6 months that you were on leave and then what led you to formally retire.
Yep. So I went, I retired out of Fort Hood, or not Fort Hood, Fort Bliss in Texas at El Paso. And the job that I had allowed me time for myself,
Yes.
so which was good and bad,
Right.
So like I said, I never was one to go out into the bars and do things like that. And I just came to a point where, I left the military and I didn't know who I was
Right.
because I'd been this person for so long,
Right.
and it's easy to go back to that person,
Right.
you know, as opposed to going out of your comfort zone and becoming a new person. So I had to figure out who I was.
Right.
And then I had to figure out what did I want to do. And I knew that what I was doing wasn't working for me.
Right.
So I had to change that. And so I reached out to the VA. The VA helped me out tremendously. And I'm a big fan of the VA.
Yeah.
Now, there's a lot of people in a lot of different places that haven't had great service at the VA.
Right.
But I've had good service.
Right.
And, you know, the government's done right by me by,
Right.
you know, keeping their promises as well. And so once I had that figured out, then I had to figure out a new mission
Right.
of what I wanted to do, where I fit in.
Yeah.
And then I went into defense contracting.
Yeah. Before we get there, though, and we're going to end on what you did after as part of that transition. You reached the VA, and you had a counselor to ask you a question that really sunk in with you.
Yep. So you go through a lot of stuff, but I mean, she came to me and she was like, I didn't fit the classic alcoholic things.
Right.
I'd never been in trouble. I never got dismissed from a job. I never checked those blocks.
Right.
But she asked me, she was like, why do you drink? And that's what I do.
Right.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And it's, you know, quitting drinking alcohol is one of the worst things for your body.
Mm-hmm.
But you can't do it by yourself.
Right.
It's tough. So then, you know, next thing you know, you're looking at 12-step programs, and I'm here to tell you, 12-step programs are the way to go.
Yeah.
They got it figured out, and it pulls you out of yourself.
Right.
Because I didn't have a drinking problem, I had a me problem.
Right.
And so it helped me set those things right in my life to where I could accept. Now, there's things that are my responsibility, and I hold blame for,
Right.
you know, or guilt for.
Right.
And I always probably will.
Right.
But it's less than what it was, you know, when I was crazy and when I was drinking and when
Right.
I was, you know, so it's manageable.
Right. Now, and you said that a few times as well, when that period of time that you were crazy. But what's neat about, I think, the journey, what I've seen is that, and this is why I brought up your wife a lot. You've been married over 33 years. She stood by you every step of the way.
Yep.
You raised beautiful kids that are successful. They're stable. That you were still very engaged in your family. You didn't completely check out. And I know a lot of people, they have some struggles when they come back to their family. And I know you had some bumps in that road just trying to figure out who you were. But you were always there as a husband, as a father.
I always viewed it as obligation, responsibility.
Yeah.
Those were the two things that I always did.
Right.
I wasn't there mentally or emotionally because, you know, I didn't know what my emotions were.
Right.
You know, I was kind of lost. I didn't know who I was. And so then I spent a lot of time being present but not being present,
Yes.
you know, and that took its toll, you know, on my kids and my wife. And then
Right.
eventually we worked it out. My kids like me now.
Yeah.
You know, my kids are excellent people, and I tell people, you know, my kids are good, and it's not because of me.
Right.
Because I was being selfish, running around the world doing what I wanted to do, and their mom was putting in the hard work.
Mm-hmm.
You know, so they're exceptional people because of their mom, not because of me.
And there's something that you mentioned to me that I think all people should know relative to your transition. What you learned, you mentioned to me, is that it's not the trauma that defines you.
No, so trauma is trauma,
Yeah.
and it doesn't matter where it comes from, whether it's combat, whether it's military sexual assault,
Right.
whether it's from first responders and firemen or policemen, or, you know, trauma is trauma, and it affects us all the same. The cause might be different, but the
Right.
feelings are the same, and the feelings are what you have to deal with.
Right.
You know,
Very true.
and you have to create a way that you can deal with them while maintaining, you know, figuring out who you are and
Right.
what do you want to be when you grow up.
Exactly.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So
And the other thing you mentioned to me is that there's no magic pill to fix anything.
there
So-
isn't. So I got a lot of friends that expect the VA to give them a pill and fix something.
Right.
The truth is, you got to put in the work.
Yep.
And when we start talking about looking inside ourselves and figuring things out about us and who we are and who we want to be, what kind of resentments we have, who wronged you, who did you wrong,
Right.
you know, those things, that takes work,
It does.
you know, and it touches a lot of things that you don't want to deal with anymore.
Yep.
But you need to if you want to heal and if you want to move forward.
And so, Greg, I'm going to summarize this real quick. 21 years of service in both the Marines and in the Army. But what's kind of cool, and then you were in active combat. You weren't just stateside in an office or on one of our bases. You were actually in combat trying to find bombs that could blow you and your other service members up, which alone is traumatic. The last 6 months, I said 6 months, but I think you took terminal leave in the last 4 months.
Yeah.
And you knew something that needed to occur. You knew that you needed to get the help that you needed to get. And you took the time to do it.
Yep.
You self-checked in. You found a way to figure it out, which helped you get to that point where you can then transition to the private sector, right? But let me say this before you tell us briefly about your private sector, that during that period of time in service, you completed your degree, and you got a lot of useful skills while you were in the service. So you fulfilled all of the missions. You were a military man like your father, and you completed that degree that your father wanted you to complete.
Oh yeah, he got his degree, and I got it before he died. So that was a good thing about it.
I love it. And then you transitioned into the private sector. So how'd you get those first few jobs? So you've got all the help that you need inside now.
Yep.
And then it became transition to the private sector.
So I'm spiritually, mentally, and somewhat physically correct. And so then those are like our three pillars. It's physically, mentally, and spiritually fit. You know what I mean?
Right.
And physically, I'm still broken and beat up, and
Sure.
I have health issues. But I don't know. I lost my train of thought.
No, that's okay. But you mentioned that you're 90% disabled.
I am.
So you have screws in your knees, right, and ankles, and then a rod in your back, fused in your back.
Yeah.
So you're a true war hero, the kind that I see on television. But you've done well. You've built, a wonderful family, 21-year career. You're now leading an organization to help train other service members to do what you achieved. Because a lot of service members don't make it to that point that they transition successfully.
Yep.
They struggle between homelessness and joblessness or being underskilled. But you were able to find your path.
Yeah, and it was very. It was almost like the relationships that I made in the military, because that's what propelled me into defense contracting,
right?
And then eventually over here to Serato and WTA.
Right.
So I love what I do now. I enjoy working with the people that I work with. Every day is a blessing for me. Right. Yeah. I've done just about everything in my life I want to do, except for maybe be a grandpa.
Right.
But it's, I'm content.
Right.
And that's the key is, where do you get to a point where you're content with what you're doing and who you are and where you're at?
Right.
I could come to work and tell people, that I'm this and that, but, I don't tell people about myself. I don't really throw things out there because it's mine. For one, I'm kind of a private person, but I don't shy away from anything that's, if you want to talk to me about drinking, I'll talk to anybody about drinking.
Right.
You know what I mean? Because I know if you want me to talk about war and I can do that, know.
Right.
But I just don't run around and make conversation just for conversation's sake, so.
So as we close this, Greg, and I know we went a little longer than we needed to, but I think the discussion was so important. What would you tell your fellow Serato Corporation employee, team member, and then what would you tell the world, not just about Greg, but about your journey and how they can find their own journey in this world?
The journey part's pretty easy. Just don't quit.
Yeah.
And that's the thing is because once you give up, then, if you're going to quit on the easy things, you're going to quit on the hard things. And you're going to look back years later and wonder what if, and nobody wants that, And that leads to a whole bunch of problems in itself for people. For the people I work with is, do the right thing.
Right.
Don't ever quit.
Right.
And we'll cross the finish line together. You know what I mean?
Let me say this. I know we're in our closing piece, but you mentioned the word quick. And there's something that stood out in our prior conversation. If I remember correctly, I think you mentioned that when you decided to retire, you felt like you were quitting on your team.
Yep.
But then through your transition piece, you realized that you weren't necessarily quitting on them. And then I think what I took is that your family, knowing that you have a spouse that's been there the whole time, you have kids that have been with you the whole time, that led you to understanding that you weren't quitting. You're just making that transition to the next group.
Just moving in a different direction is all.
Yeah.
So.
And then the other thing you said to me is that being at Serato has become your new mission.
It is.
Now
It
you've
is,
got your
yeah.
new passion and mission to help other people that need your guidance and experience to get through their transition.
Yep. It's always, we talk about service and giving back, and it's we provide a service that helps make people and families better.
Right.
That's the way that I look at it. I mean, of course, we're here to make money, but, in that process, we're creating a whole much more good than we are, money. Right. So, and that's important. Right. That's important.
Well, Greg, I appreciate you joining me for this conversation. This conversation and my prior conversations with you have been incredible. For me, it's kind of rare to meet, and I know you say that you're not unique, and I hear you, but what you've done, what you've survived, I think is really unique, because not a lot of people have the level of experience and trauma being in active duty war that you've had, and then build out a 21-year career that is absolutely amazing. You got the degree, you've got a family that's successful, you're here to talk about it. I appreciate what you do, and I know that others appreciate what you do as well.
Well, thank you, man.
Yeah.
I'm just sucking air till I die. That's it.
Thanks for joining us on Serato Live.
Thank you for listening to the I Build America podcast. Please subscribe, share, and comment, and be sure to join us next time for more insights and inspiring conversations on building a powerful American workforce. I Build America, building workforce success one podcast at a time.
I build